Well, we have now had a gigantic and almost interminable article in the New York Times, which sets it all out in painstaking detail. Now, I want to make a few points about this article, which has appeared in the New York Times and which is being discussed and talked about by all sorts of people. And that is that it is one of the most mendacious articles I have ever read about the Ukraine conflict. It gives a totally one-sided picture of the conflict from an American point of view, and one which I myself do not recognize in many of its details. The article, for example, is entitled "The Secret History of America's Involvement in the War in the Ukraine War." It speaks about how the story that is outlined in the article about the extent of America's involvement in the war has not been told before. The last is flat out untrue. If you've been following these programs, if you've been listening to programs on this channel, if you've been listening to what we have been discussing every day, Alex Christoforou and I, on the Duran, if you've been following Alex Christoforou's own channel, if you've been listening to what has been said in many other programs, Brian Beletic at the New Atlas, for example, there is absolutely nothing in this article that would surprise you. Now, I think it was about 2 weeks ago that I said, firstly, on this channel, and then together with Alex Christoforou, in a long program we did on the Duran, that this claim that the conflict between Ukraine and Russia was a proxy war between the United States and Russia, that didn't seem to me to be strictly true. A proxy war is a kind of chess game, basically, played by two great powers against each other in other areas, in other places. You could argue that the conflict in Vietnam was a proxy war between the United States and the Soviet Union. You could say the same was true about the US support for the Mujahideen in Afghanistan. You could talk about all sorts of other regional conflicts that took place in all sorts of other places during the Cold War. The conflict in Angola in 1975, the conflict in Ethiopia and the Ogaden in 1978, even the Indo-Pakistani War of 1971 had some elements of a proxy war about it, with the US providing military aid to Pakistan, even as the Soviet Union provided military aid to India. But there was always a fundamental difference about those wars and this one, and that was that all of those wars were fought in territory that was separate from the national territories of the two superpowers. And it was fought for limited objectives, very limited objectives, for objectives of strategic influence. And they never prevented the two superpowers from maintaining contacts and conducting diplomacy with each other. The Ukraine war is different. First of all, it was a war of choice by the United States involving Russia. And the objective was not a limited one. It was exactly as Wes Mitchell set out in that article he wrote in the National Interest in August 2021. It was to defeat Russia. It was to defeat Russia in war. It was, in other words, a war against Russia, not a proxy war, a war against Russia conducted by a coalition of countries, of which the primary leader was the United States. So the United States played the main role. Ukraine played a very, very important role, but ultimately, and in some respects, a secondary one, in the sense that though the Ukrainians were actually doing the fighting, their soldiers were the ones who were battling the Russians on the battlefields. Everything else about the war, intelligence, command and control, logistical supply, and of course the economic war that was a part of this war. There is no separation here between the military struggle in Ukraine and the economic war that has also been waged. All of that was ultimately conducted by the United States together with the other members of the coalition. Primarily the Five Eyes states, the United Kingdom, Britain, Canada, Australia, and of course the United States as well, but also Germany, France, and other NATO states also deeply involved. And this long article provides us with many of the details, though it gives an extremely distorted account of them. It shows, for example, that the United States, the conduct of the war was absolutely run by the United States. Most of the planning of military operations from early on in 2022 was done in Wiesbaden by members of the US military, by General Milley, by General Donahue, by General Cavalli, the head of the NATO forces in Europe, by General Austin, who was the US Defense Secretary. We learn that the United States planned the big offensives, the offensive that took place in autumn 2022 in Kharkiv and Kherson region. I'll come to that shortly. The United States planned the major offensive that was done against Zaporozhye to try to break through to the Black Sea in 2023. The United States made most of the military procurement decisions. It's now clear that it was American generals who were instrumental in insisting that Ukraine be provided with the M777 howitzers and the HIMARS rocket systems. And this was done in order to effect military operations which these same American officers, these same American generals had planned. It was these American generals, not the Ukrainians as such, who insisted that Ukraine be supplied with the ATACMS missiles, contrary to the wishes of other senior military defense officials in the Pentagon itself. It was, in effect, a small group of American generals and their subordinates, plus the political leadership in Washington, the Biden administration, and the other officials there, Jake Sullivan, Tony Blinken, and all of those, who were running the war. Now, the Ukrainians did have a say. After all, it was their soldiers who were doing the fighting. And much of the article is a catalogue of disagreements between the Americans and the Ukrainians. And basically, I think a fair description of the article is that it says that the American plans were excellent, that the war would have been won if they had been followed, but that the Ukrainians were always disobeying instructions that they were being given by the Americans, they would go off on frolics of their own. General Sirski, for example, in 2023 sought to retake Bakhmut when the Americans wanted him to focus exclusively on Zaporozhye, all of those sort of things. So the only reason why these superbly executed and wonderful plans that the Americans drew up failed was because the Ukrainians themselves wouldn't execute them. And this is, I'm going to say straightforwardly, as far as I'm concerned, a flat out lie. It is simply not true. In fact, if you actually study, if you actually take a cold eye and look through this article and look at the various operations that the Americans planned, what you notice is that every single one of these operations, on its own measure, failed. So, to take one example, the Kherson offensive of 2022, still accounted by most people as a great success by Ukraine. It did, after all, result in the recapture of the city of Kherson on the Dnieper River. This operation must be considered an operational failure. In fact, that was a point made at the time, as I very well remember, by Brian Beletic. And what we read in this New York Times article absolutely vindicates his analysis of that time. Specifically, the purpose of this offensive was not to retake Kherson city. It was to destroy the Russian army group west of the Dnieper, the army group that was defending Kherson city, and then to cross the Dnieper and to advance on Crimea itself. The plan failed, and the reason it failed was not because the Ukrainians messed it up, but because the Russians carried out an extremely skillful defense, as I very well and clearly remember, in Kherson region, west of the Dnieper River. They defended successfully for several weeks. They inflicted very severe losses on the Ukrainians, and then they managed to evacuate their entire force from the west bank of Ukraine to the east bank of the Ukraine, of the east bank of the Dnieper in good order. So the result was that by the time the Ukrainians reached the Dnieper, they were exhausted, they'd suffered extremely severe losses, they were faced by an intact Russian army on the east bank, and they couldn't advance further towards Crimea as had been the original plan. Similarly, there's huge amount of criticism of General Sirski over the Zaporozhye offensive. It's absolutely clear that the Americans now planned the Zaporozhye offensive to the minutest detail. It was they who planned to break through to Melitopol and beyond Melitopol to the Black Sea, to the Sea of Azov. Again, clearly the plan was to advance on Crimea as well. All of those things. And there's been a drumbeat of claims that the reason the operation failed was because the Ukrainians instead diverted forces to Bakhmut, first to defend Bakhmut in the winter and early spring of 2023, and then after Bakhmut had been captured by the Russians, to seek to recapture Bakhmut. And then there were claims that this supposedly created an enormous diversion of forces which weakened the major thrust by the Ukrainians on the Russian forces in Zaporozhye, and that it was this that led to Ukraine's defeat. Well, again, to anybody who followed the fighting in detail, one could see that there was no truth to this claim at all. The Ukrainians were never in any position to simply give up on or forget Bakhmut. Bakhmut was then and is now too strategically important simply to sacrifice in the way that the Americans are now saying the Ukrainians should have done, and that for the Ukrainians to have done that, for them to have withdrawn from the Bakhmut area in the way that the Americans insisted, that would have exposed their forces in northern Donbass to potential disaster, almost certainly without providing the necessary strike force to break through to Zaporozhye, which was anyway almost certainly unachievable. So we have this constant attempt to blame the Ukrainians, every mistake, every failure on the Ukrainians. Never at any point in this article is there any admission of what is certainly the truth, which is that, on the contrary, the reason all of these plans failed, every one of them, was because the Americans, and it was the Americans, Cavoli, Donahue, Milley, and all of the others, were consistently outgeneraled by the Russians. The Russians, contrary again to what much of this article says, in 2022, 2023, were overall outnumbered by the Ukrainians. The Ukrainians in 2023 had no shortage of equipment for their offensive. But the Russians proved tougher than the Americans had anticipated. The Russians were able to respond to all of the various plans that the Americans had. In fact, they seem to have had remarkably good insight as to many of these plans. The Russians adapted themselves to all of these offensives and were able to counter them, and to counter them successfully. And it's absolutely clear that after the failure of the 2023 offensive, the Americans had no clear plan any longer about what to do at all. So there's muddle and confusion. There's, again, an attempt to pretend that the entire Kursk operation that Ukraine launched in the summer of 2024 was something that was conjured up by the Ukrainians all by themselves without any input from the Americans. I don't myself believe that. I am sure that there was a significant amount of input. There are admissions that the United States did indeed attempt to help the Ukrainians destroy the Crimean Bridge. ATACMS missiles were supplied to Ukraine for precisely that purpose. Biden initially, the Biden administration initially had resisted that plan, but eventually, as it always did, it came round to it, and I suspect indeed even advocated it. The article claims that ATACMS missiles did indeed strike the bridge, but only caused potholes in it. I don't believe that either, by the way. I am confident, from what I remember of the conflict, I'm confident, I'm not absolutely sure, but I'm confident that not a single ATACMS missile ever actually managed to hit the Crimean Bridge. That the Russians were able to shoot all of them down. I'm going to go further, and I'm going to say that the ATACMS missiles, and this article confirms that hundreds of them were supplied, and that the decision to authorize use of ATACMS missiles for strikes into Russia was made in April 2024. Just to say, apparently around 150 additional ATACMS missiles were supplied for those kind of purposes at that time? Well, the point was that the ATACMS missile failed in the way that it was intended to work. It didn't achieve its intended purpose. And we learned that not only were the Americans engaging in the offensive military planning, but they also selected the targets. There are all kinds of euphemisms about this. Supposedly they didn't select the targets, they simply gave the Ukrainians points of interest. But they selected the targets in Russia, in Crimea, in the area of the battle zones in Donbass and elsewhere for the Ukrainians to attack. And as a member of the Duran community pointed out to me, in fact, I think it was more than one, shortly after the HIMARS systems were supplied to Ukraine, the Americans actually assisted. In fact, actually not assisted, they controlled the actual launches of the HIMARS missiles. It was they who made the decisions as to how the HIMARS would be used and what targets they would strike. So this was an American war. An American war. The only difference between it and, say, the Vietnam War was that American infantry was not openly involved, though even this article concedes that American military personnel and American military officers were based in Ukraine, and many of them actually arrived in places close to the front lines, where they were obviously playing more than just an advisory role. So anyway, there it is. It is all outlined there. It is a huge attempt, in my opinion, to defend the American military for its failure. For me, the most striking revelation in this article was about the far bigger ambitions behind the autumn 2022 offensive than had been appreciated at the time. It explains why, following the failure of that offensive, the failure to destroy the Russian army group west of the Dnieper, the failure to cross the Dnieper and to advance onto Crimea, why, knowing that failure, General Milley at that time briefly became a supporter of negotiations with the Russians, though he very quickly changed his tune when he decided, when this, as I said, group of officers and their political masters decided instead to turn towards the Zaporozhye offensive in 2023. But it was, this article says that in some respects, it was that Kherson offensive in 2022, which was Ukraine's best chance of winning the war. By 2023, the Russians were too well organized, too well equipped, too dug in to be defeated. In autumn 2022, the Russians were much weaker, but the offensive failed, and the war in effect was lost because the Russians fought and were led far better than the Americans had expected. Now, all of this clearly, this whole article is clearly written in preparation for the defeat which is coming. And again, it really is disturbing to see how the Ukrainians are being set up as the scapegoats for their own defeat, given that, as Professor Mearsheimer has said, they were continuously led along the Primrose Path towards their own destruction from the moment when NATO membership was promised to them, and as we see now throughout the conduct of the war itself. So, going back to my earlier point, we see how the plan outlined by Mr. Wes Mitchell in that article in August in August 2021 in the National Interest was almost immediately put into practice. And the story, the true story of the Ukraine war, is the story of its complete failure. Now, that still doesn't tell us where the situation is going to lead to from this point going forward. Now, the Russians have read this article in the New York Times. Peskov has been asked to comment about it, and he has said that there is nothing in this article that is new to the Russians, and that unquestionably is true. I would say that the Russians, in the face of this, have exercised a degree of self-discipline that is truly astonishing. Knowing the role the United States has been playing in the war, it's remarkable that they have held back from stronger action, such as, for example, shooting down American surveillance aircraft or surveillance drones, which have clearly been providing, well, as the article confirms, have been providing the Ukrainians real-time intelligence on Russian military positions, making it possible for the Americans and the Ukrainians, and I stress the Americans as well, to target even individual Russian commanders. For example, the Russians have taken no steps to try to interfere with American military satellites, which they undoubtedly do have the capacity to do. Some of their air defense systems are configured to destroy satellites, but they never did so. They've never sought to cause problems for the United States in other parts of the world. And I think we now have, by the way, a conclusive explanation of the story of this constant drumbeat of stories about the Russians in the autumn of 2022, considering the possible use of tactical nuclear weapons. The Russians have consistently denied that they ever gave any thought at all to this possibility. The article in the New York Times says that General Surovikin, who was for a few weeks the overall Russian commander, apparently thought aloud about the possibility of using tactical nuclear weapons to rescue the military force on the west bank of the Dnieper River in Kherson region if it ran into real danger. The Americans were able to pick up that comment of Surovikin's. There's no evidence in this article that it originated from anyone in Moscow, from Gerasimov, the chief of the general staff, from Putin himself, from the Russian defense minister, Sergei Shoigu. The Russians will have found out about this because, according to the Americans themselves, the Americans passed on this information to the Chinese and asked the Chinese to intervene with the Russians to persuade the Russians against using tactical nuclear weapons. So it's a certainty that the Chinese will have briefed the Russians as to the fact that the Americans had picked up this comment of Surovikin's. And I am going to suggest here that that almost certainly provides the explanation for Surovikin's subsequent dismissal as the commander of the Russian forces in the area of the special military operation. It was a breach of discipline, a breach of communications discipline, which the Kremlin will not have felt able to overlook. So anyway, we have all of this detail now, but the big story here The Russians, as I said, are aware of this article. They're aware of everything that happened. They have exercised incredible discipline and self-restraint. And this will not have been an easy thing to do. We can be certain that there will have been intense arguments and recriminations about all of this within the Kremlin, within the defense ministry. There will have been people who would have sided with Putin, who almost certainly insisted on this policy of restraint. But many of the generals, many of the commanders will have been furious about this. And anyway, there will have been lots of arguments and quarrels and disagreements about this. But overall, the discipline held. Nonetheless, the fact that the Russians have been involved in this kind of conflict, which the Americans essentially organized against them, will have had an effect. It's impossible for me to see how, after what has happened, the Russians can realistically compromise on the demands that they've made beyond those that Putin himself made in June 2024. Many Russians have died as a result of this war. Probably nowhere near as many as the Americans believe, but nonetheless, thousands, almost certainly tens of thousands of Russians have died. And this is not something that is going to be easily forgiven or forgotten. Certainly not in Moscow. And certainly not even more in the various provincial cities where most Russian soldiers ultimately come from. And that, as I've said previously in previous programs, does limit Putin's room for political maneuver. Even if he himself were inclined to compromise, and I'm not certain, by the way, that he is, he has to face the fact that his country has been, in effect, in a kind of war with the United States for the last 3 years, and he will find it very, very difficult indeed to persuade people in Russia that he should compromise on Russian objectives on the brink of victory against, at the wish of the country that has been waging war against Russia in the way that it has. And I'm going to make a further guess. One of the reasons why opinion across the global south and amongst Russia's BRICS friends has been so supportive of Russia over the last 3 years is that the Russians, obviously knowing all of these things, will have gone out of their way to inform their BRICS friends about it, to inform China, India, Brazil, all of those countries about the reality of the war that they had to fight and about who the other side to that war actually was. Anyway, this is what I want to say about this New York Times article and about the diplomacy that's taking place, or at least for the moment not taking place in Ukraine. All the indications are, as I said, that in the next few weeks, maybe in May, a major Russian offensive will begin. I don't expect a Putin-Trump telephone call to change the situation. And for the record, I don't think that Donald Trump really does intend to impose tariffs or sanctions against the Russians in any meaningful way, certainly not in any way that could change their calculations. And even if he tried, I still don't think it would change Russian calculations.